We were talking about the middle of the 1200s last week, and one of the things that began to go on during this time was Franciscan and Dominican friars began to move through the Muslim lands and began to found hospices. Hospice was sort of a place where anyone could stay who was a visitor. It would be for people who got sick or for people who are traveling or something like that. It would be the equivalent of a hotel, but they didn't charge anything. These were places particularly where pilgrims could find lodging, pilgrims who were on the Hajj with the Muslims or pilgrims that were traveling to the Holy Land. I think I told you in the last presentation that the problem with the Muslim community in the Holy Lands was the Turks. And so the Turkish Muslims, the Turks as they're known, that went through, were very anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, all this sort of thing, and there was a lot of persecution and murders. But that was not true in general in Muslim lands. In Muslim lands, people could travel comfortably and stuff like that. But the Franciscans and the Dominicans began to open up these places. And the idea was that the practice of charity would teach people about the faith, because if you go into a Muslim country as a Christian, let's say if I were to go into a Muslim country, I would not be allowed to teach Christian faith. And if anyone, as a result of my teaching, decided to become a Christian, I would be subject to execution. And that would be true today in a place like Egypt, things like that. You just don't do that. So what they decided was by founding these hospices and taking care of the people and wearing their habits, so they were visibly Christian missionaries, that they could do what they wanted to do with preaching. This was not very successful in the Muslim communities. Conversion has never been easy, because if a Muslim converts, the Muslim is subject to death and exclusion from their family and then ultimately death. So this did not bring about a lot of conversions, but it did help Christian communities who over a period of time in the isolation in Muslim lands had been cut off from Rome. And so now, through these missionaries, they had contact with Rome through the different societies. So it worked out very, very well. It also helped the people of Europe to stop thinking of the East as such a strange and bizarre land. I think you know that one of the great difficulties when you have problems with people is that we don't know. Like, for instance, if I don't know any Jewish person, I have what do you want to call it, a model of a Jew in my mind that comes from rumors and gossips I've heard, but doesn't really exist anywhere. And the key, we used to have a program, I don't know if we still do in the United States, because under the present administration, programs like this are stopped. But we used to have a program where, number one, there was a radio station called Radio for Europe. And it was all over Europe, Eastern Europe, and this sort of thing, and made American ideas and everything seem real. They were real ideas. And we encouraged people in the United States to go to schools all over the world, and simultaneously we took students from all over the world into our country. And that's kind of the way you get people to understand one another. One of the things you know in psychology is that anything any person does will always make sense to them. And so the reason is, oftentimes we see someone do something, it makes no sense to us. So we're heavily judge it. But if we can actually see why they do it, we know why it makes sense. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll agree with it, but we do know why it's done, and then it makes sense. In 1294, Boniface VIII became Pope, and he was insistent on the supreme authority of the Pope over any civil authority. He believed the Pope was higher than any king and basically had authority over all kings. One of the main conflicts he had with the kings of Europe was their right to tax bishops and priests. This was really important with regards to bishops, because we mentioned several times the bishops had become a very wealthy group, kind of a nobility on its own, as it still kind of exists that way. But they became this wealthy nobility on its own, and so they wanted specifically to tax them. King Philip, and this is in France, called Philip the Fair. King Philip threatened clergy who did not pay taxes and ceased paying money that would usually sent to Rome. So one of the things he did was, in his taxing, he tried to cut off money that was to go to the Pope, and that money needed to stay to the church in France. Boniface then created a new diocese in France. Remember, at this time, dioceses were not created with much frequency. And so the great missionary effort that took place when we moved into the New World and Asia and stuff like that, that wasn't going on. So the church wasn't really growing a lot geographically at this time. So he created a new diocese in France and appointed a bishop who was absolutely hostile to King Philip. Philip immediately imprisoned him. Most of the French nobility and the clergy as well sided with the king. We don't know whether they did that they thought the king was correctly exercising his rights. Because remember, for a long period of time in different places, the king had the right to appoint the bishop, and then he had the right to approve a bishop. And so this idea of the Pope appointing all bishops and civil authorities not having any role in it was new at this time. So they sided with him, and what they did was accuse the Pope of heresy and simony. Simony is selling an office, where if you want to be a bishop and I'm the Pope, if you give me $10,000, I'll make you bishop, something like that, okay? So they accused the Pope of that. It's a crime in the Catholic Church. As he was preparing to excommunicate Philip, the Pope was arrested. And while he was rescued from the arrest, he died a month later of the treatment that he had received when he was imprisoned. Boniface's successor, 1305, was Benedict the 11th, and he ruled for only 1 year. So he came in, was their pope for 1 year. The Archbishop of Bordeaux was the next elected king, taking the name of Clement V. And you can imagine, with the death of the Pope, after only a year, there was some confusion in getting the conclave together to elect a new Pope. We saw that with regards to John Paul I, who I think was in maybe a couple months. And we saw that also with John the 23rd, whose death came rather suddenly. But as Clement, who was elected, was in France, he chose to be crowned in Lyon. And after that, he intended to go to Rome, but he never did. He never actually went to Rome. He avoided the territories used by Philip the Fair and settled in Avignon, which is a city which belonged to the Pope. Remember, we talked much earlier about the fact that the rule in Europe now was, if I were to die and to leave my home in San Luis Obispo to the Pope, that home actually became papal property, and it could not be bought, couldn't be sold or anything. It was papal property. Well, the city of Avignon was that way, and there were several pockets of papal property all over Europe until the time about the French Revolution. Those revolutions that went on that overthrew the kings all over Europe eliminated papal properties in all kinds of places. So anyway, this was a city that belonged to the Pope. Several times he made plans to return to Rome, but each time the king persuaded him to stay, thinking he would have more influence if he remained in France. The king really didn't have a lot of influence over him, but at least he had him contained. This began what is called, most historians call this the Avignon Papacy. I think it went on for about 70 years. In Roman Catholic histories, it's oftentimes referred to as the Babylonian Captivity. And that's because the Jews, when they were taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, had a 70-year exile. So they called it the Babylonian Captivity. The king wanted to try Pope Clement. He wanted, Pope Clement to try Benedict the 11th, but the Pope stopped the proceedings. And in exchange, Philip had all the people attacking the Pope absolved, okay? So the exchange was the Pope would not try the preceding Pope, but what he would do would absolve all those people, remember, who had attacked and kidnapped him, and then he died right after the captivity. So they were absolved. Boniface's decree against France was removed from papal records. Boniface, remember, had taken these steps against France. And then finally, the Pope agreed to the king's request for the suppression of the Knights Templar. Remember, we talked about the Knights Templar earlier. Notice now that the Pope is actually in France when the King of France persuades him to the destruction of the Knights Templar. And you can see that while the Pope was not living under territory ruled by Philip, Philip had a lot of authority over the Pope. And so we watched these different things go on. In 1347, a child, Catherine, was born in Siena, Italy. And while very young, she became very strongly devoted to the Lord, very inspirational child. In her teens, when her parents wanted her to join the social life of the city and get married, Catherine wanted to be consecrated to the Lord. And what she did was cut off her hair as a sign of the decision. The parents finally were able to support her, and she became a Dominican. To cut off your hair oftentimes meant you were putting on a religious habit, and a woman would not go out in public with her hair cut. So she dressed in a white dress and a black cape of the Dominicans and divided her time between the church, her home, a hospital, and a leprosarium. That's a hospital for lepers. The thing to note here is that Catherine at this time is not going into a convent of Dominican nuns. What Catherine is doing is living this life at home and doing this kind of ministry. And so she's not in a cloistered convent, but is actually doing ministry around. And you could do that as a member. You couldn't do that as a Dominican priest at the time. Dominican priests traveled around, but in groups. Catherine did this kind of alone. Around the age of 20, Catherine had a vision of Jesus and Mary in which she was told she was married to Jesus and had a very important role in the church. And oftentimes, statues of Catherine of Siena picture her as a bride in front of a figure of Jesus Christ. You find that in paintings and statuary. Catherine attracted a large group of disciples. She was a very powerfully spiritual woman. Her writings betray a deep, deep spirituality. And in fact, she's one of the doctors of the church now. But Catherine of Siena was a very holy person and not locked up in a convent. She was, doing this work in the hospital, in the leprosarium, teaching. She was doing all this kind of work and was wearing the habit of a nun. So she attracted a lot of people to follow her. This group, incidentally, included artists, poets, civil authorities, and religious leaders. It would be like if you were in Siena and you were anyone important, you knew Catherine. And they became very involved that way. Catherine was a mystic and brought about the conversion and reform of many, many people. She had a very mystical, a loving relationship with Jesus Christ, and this mystical marriage, it was called. She would speak of Jesus in very human, loving terms. And the way she spoke of Jesus made Jesus very, very attractive to people. And so she brought about powerful conversions in people. A lot of really strange people had immense conversions with her. We have a great collection of the letters she wrote to many, many people. And they show of her great spirituality and also of her dramatic influence. She had a huge influence. She constantly wrote to the Pope and was constantly telling him to return to Rome. She again and again pushed this. And while he did not return to Rome during her lifetime, most people believe it is the influence of Catherine and her letters that got the Pope finally to go to Rome. In 1376, Catherine went to Avignon and most probably spoke with the Pope. We don't know about any conversation that took place, but 3 months later, the Pope, Gregory XI, moved to Rome. Catherine continued her work in the church and for the city of Siena. He did go during her lifetime, but not exactly when she spoke to him. So we don't know quite the connection, but she had some influence on him. She died in Rome at the age of 33. She saw very few results of her efforts, but she demonstrated what one person was able to do for the church through the power of love and good works. If you notice, we've been going through, and we're going to go through a lot of this for a while now. There is in the church at this time in history a great desire for reform. Authorities will not become too involved in this. The priests, the bishops and stuff do not become too involved in this. There are certain powerful exceptions to that, but they do not become so involved in this. And there's a desperate need for reform on the part of the people. The clergy now sits sort of between that. There's some of the clergy, like some of the bishops, that are great people for reform, but basically not. Around the time of Thomas More, that's a couple hundred years after this, we'll find out that one of the common sayings was that no one wanted anyone to know if you were a priest. And it's because the reputation for spirituality and things like that were not good at all. But people like Catherine were beginning to rise out of the laity. When Rudolph of Habsburg came to the throne, Germany had been for 20 years without an emperor. So this Rudolph of Habsburg, the Habsburgs will become one of the most important families in Europe for quite a period of time. But when he comes to the throne, Germany had been without an emperor. Now remember, the emperor, the Pope does not have the right to elect the emperor, but the Pope has the right to crown him. So even if everyone elects you the emperor, and there were a group of electors, but if they elect you the king, let's say, of Germany, only the Pope could anoint you as a Holy Roman Emperor. So he gave up all claim to the Papal States and turned east in order to acquire land, wanted to move Hungary, that area. But what he did was give up all claim to the Papal States, and in exchange with that, we will watch the Pope look to the anointing of the next Habsburg who comes up. In 1347, Charles of Bohemia had been elected emperor, and he was very, very devoted to the church. But the country of Germany was suffering the result of the plague, and social and political life were all in turmoil. There were quarrels between regional princes, and fanatical preachers were stirring people up against the Jews, who were being blamed for everything. It's kind of a consistent thing historically that people in a time of real trouble, when the trouble's sort of beyond their ability to deal with it and their understanding of where it came from, it's kind of traditional, you blame the Jews. And so we'll watch that. The financial problems, everything that were going on in Germany, were blamed on the Jews before the Second World War. They suffered from it as much as anyone did, and they certainly weren't the cause of it. But this is a consistent thing in history. So this emperor sought to eliminate the conflict in his country by setting up a process for electing the emperor. There were 7 electors representing both the state and the church, but the Pope was not one of them. He opened up a huge university in Prague, a very famous one, and brought the Slavic language into the liturgy. So he did a lot for the church to get the church more appealing to the people. Now remember, the language of the church at this time in history had become Latin. It had moved from Greek to Latin, but Latin was no longer the language of the people. We had watched the French language come up, the Italian language. The Italian language is the descendant of Latin. When we look at ancient languages, languages are all in families. And so you look at the ancient Hebrew moves into what is known as Aramaic, which is what Jesus spoke, that actually moves into Arabic. And you watch these languages go through these kind of changes. But it's of the nature of churches, you end up locked in the language at the time that the things take place, largely because of the sacred literature. Now, our sacred literature was all written in Greek and Hebrew, but at the time the church got freedom and could publish that and all that sort of thing, Latin had become the language. So this was all brought, for us, was locked into Latin. In 1378, this year marked the beginning of one of the very darkest periods in church history. We call it the Great Western Schism. And remember, the East had broken off, and we had some contest with regards to who should be emperor at times, but anyone with an education knew exactly who was the emperor, who was the pope. And at this particular time, it doesn't work that way. Pope Gregory XI died, and to elect a new pope, the first conclave in 75 years was held in Rome. Why had it been gone from Rome 75 years? Because the Pope was in Avignon, and that's where the election, everything would take place. And they consistently elected French popes. Why? Because the French Pope Clement appointed French cardinals. So French cardinals dominated. So they elected French popes, and it was a French pope who eventually moved back to Rome. So this one, it was held in Rome. Up to this point, the conclaves were held in France. The word conclave refers to the fact that the cardinals are locked up while the election is decided. It's a very specific ceremony. The cardinals will all go into the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is closed and ceremoniously locked. The word in Latin for key is clavis. So conclave means with the key. So the building is locked. And once it's locked, there's a series of apartments off the side where the cardinals live. But no one is allowed to go in or come out. Now, I understand a couple times in history, a cardinal has gotten very sick or has died, and the door has been opened and they've been removed, and the door has been closed. But that person could never go back in and participate in the election again either. They are out. That's violated. And the election is supposed to take place in great secrecy. So anyway, the people of Rome really wanted a Roman, or at least an Italian. However, 11 of the 16 cardinals were French. I told you they were appointing French cardinals. So 11 of the 16 are French. One of the things that went on when I was a youngster, there was a long series of Italian popes. In fact, I think that before the election of John Paul, people didn't think a non-Italian would be elected. And when John Paul II was elected, that was the first time we'd had a non-Italian in a very long time. But when Pius XII was elected, he was the first time a Roman had been elected in a very long time. And there's a hymn in the Catholic Church called Christus Vincit, and the verse is, Christ conquers, Christ reigns, Christ rules. And the crowd spontaneously broke into Christus Vincit when Pius XII was announced. Because let's face it, he is the bishop of the city of Rome. And so they wanted a Roman bishop. It's understandable. An Italian was elected. He was Urban VI. But there could not be a public announcement before the public announcement could be made. I think you know when a pope is elected, they count the votes. When they count the votes, as soon as they know who is elected, and that may be close to 3/4 of the way through the accounting. The counting's done publicly. They used to have covers over their chairs. They were like thrones set around the Sistine Chapel, and you would hit a thing on the side of it dropped the crown off your chair. And as soon as the right number, they all sort of keep a count, as soon as the right number's done, those all come down. They finish the counting. Once they finish counting, every single bishop goes up a cardinal goes up one by one and pledges their obedience to the Pope. Then the Pope is taken to a special room where they have 3 cassocks, and 3 white cassocks in 3 sizes, because they have no idea who's going to be elected. John the 23rd's case, he was so heavy that they had to tear the cassock down the back. They put it on him, but fortunately he was wearing a cloak, so he didn't look like a patient in the hospital. But anyway, they did that so that they get all this done, so that when they announce, they'll come out on the balcony, the cardinals, and one cardinal will go up to the microphone and announce the Pope's name as Pope. And then when he comes forward, they'll give his name as cardinal, so people will know. So the mob is so sure they aren't going to vote an Italian, but a Frenchman. The crowd begins to break in to the conclave. They broke through the door, but the election was already over. Okay? They left as soon as they discovered the Pope wasn't Italian. As soon as they know an Italian had been elected, the crowd left. However, Urban lacked good sense, and he was very harsh and very haughty. Today, most historians believe that Urban VI suffered from a mental disability of some kind, but he became very, very angry, rigid, and harsh as soon as he came in. That one of the interesting things about mental illness, that people with mental illness, certain kinds of mental illness, have real trouble dealing with people as they go along, but because of the mental illness, they deal in a certain way. Once they're in charge, they don't have to deal with anyone. They just order people and tell them. And so that took that form in his case. 13 of the cardinals fled to Avignon and claimed that the election was invalid because Urban was elected under fear of the Italian mob. Now notice he was not. The mob came in after he was elected. But these cardinals maintain he was elected under the fear of the mob. So they elected a new pope, naturally, a Frenchman. He took the name of Clement VII. Clement then tried to march on Rome, but failed and moved to Avignon. Once he got to Avignon, the Frenchman functioned as though he was pope in Avignon, as the previous popes had done, and the other man functioned in Rome as though he was pope. And throughout the world, they were each appointing bishops, and they were each governing places that, accepted their authority, which could be one or the other in different places in the church. At their deaths, each of their collections of cardinals selected a successor to the Pope, so that in Avignon, they elected a successor to the man in Avignon. In Rome, they elected a successor to the man in Rome. This whole situation would last until 1417. And as we mentioned, this is probably, it began in 1378 and it ended in 1417. And I don't know how much they were doing with regards to separate decrees or anything, but you'd have to choose whether you would recognize the bishops appointed by this guy or you'd recognize the cardinals appointed by the other guy or what. It was very, very difficult. Now remember, at this time, they did not have any of the, any of the communication stuff we had. So most people really didn't know. They weren't sure who, in fact, was Pope. When we look back now, we can see that Urban was elected and was the legitimate Pope. And he was elected before the mob broke in, so the mob didn't bring it about. So we now know where the line of the papacy went. But at the time, they really didn't. The situation of the popes became more and more chaotic as time went on, and people, as I mentioned, had no idea who the real pope was. In 1409, there was a council called at Pisa, and it was called to solve the problem. They elected Alexander V. What they expected was the two popes would resign and the new one would come in. He was Alexander V. However, the only result of this was they had three popes. So now there were three popes, three men who claimed legitimately to be pope. In the 12th century, an idea known as conciliarism had been born, which held that a church council holds supreme authority in the church, and all power in the church resides in the entire body of the faithful, who allow certain administrators to exercise that power. Basically, it's Jesus Christ has given power to the church as a community. And we see the text in Scripture where Jesus says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." It's easy to see all the authority there focused in Simon Peter. On the other hand, there's the time when the Holy Spirit is sent upon the apostles as a group. He says, "He who hears you hears me." And that's the group of the apostles. And so there's always been some concern about this sort of thing, whether the council has higher authority than the Pope. Now, in practical purposes, it has not been a problem at all, because every council from this point on will always notice is called by the Pope, and the Pope is a part of the council. So you can't set the council against the Pope, as church history has evolved through that. But it is, when I was in the seminary, it was an academic question that was discussed. Is the highest authority the Pope's infallibility, or is the highest authority, in fact, the council that represents the entire church? Okay? So, urged by the emperor, a council of Constance persuaded the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, to resign, and then simply deposed the Pope from Pisa, John the 23rd. One of the reasons that John the 23rd, when he was elected, took that particular title was to erase this John the 23rd, who was removed by this Council of Pisa. The third claimant to the throne, who was Benedict the 13th, lost all support, although he did die without ever giving up his claims to being Pope. However, no one elected a successor to him. So at this point, we're back down to one Pope. The Council of Constance elected a man named Martin V, and he was accepted by everyone at this point as Pope. The Council established the authority of the Council over the Pope. So this Council stated that. The role of bishops as collegial with the Pope, and a requirement for the Pope to hold general councils at regular intervals. So you see what's going on here is what we saw further back with the authority of the King of England, where the nobles got together and they exercised some authority over the King of England and sort of limited his power but recognized that he was king, this sort of thing. And we see this happen now with regards to the Pope. They recognize the authority and the position of the Pope, but he is to be in consultation with the bishops. And I'll give you an example. As a pastor, when I was pastor, we were required to have pastoral councils, which were a council of people to advise the pastor. And as pastor, I was told I could not make a decision without consulting that council, a major decision. On the other hand, I didn't need to follow their advice, but I had to listen to it. The Pastoral Council in the diocese functions the same way. In an important decision, the bishop must share it with the council and seek their advice, but in the end, he makes the decision. The Pope does that with the bishops in the church. You have to counsel. And one of the reasons is there's a verse in the Bible that says, wise decisions come from many counselors. And so the idea is you listen to a lot of people, but you are in the position to make the decision, and you make it, okay? Later popes, as you can imagine, would condemn conciliarism, although today, as I mentioned, many theologians still accept it. In fact, the doctrine of papal infallibility seems to make it unnecessary. But as a matter of fact, there's never been the conflict, so it's never been tested. From the 13th century on, there is an intense desire for a deeper spirituality among many in the church. And that was not just for religious. Okay? So right now, as I mentioned, there's this rising desire for a greater holiness among people. We're going to go through a little of how this is going to go on. Many small communities formed all over the world, and they were always directed by Franciscans or Dominicans. Remember, they're the friars, they can travel around. Monks had to stay in their monasteries and stuff. And they grew up all over Europe. The main place they grew up was Germany. There was this intense desire for spirituality. Prior to this time, the title mystic seemed to be confined to people with unusual experiences of the Lord. Like they would think of a mystic as someone who would have, have visions or has the stigmata, something like that. They saw it as something very, but at this time, they discovered that the term mystic, or it simply refers to a deep spirituality. And you could have some person where nothing unusual really goes on in their life, like Thomas Merton, who is a powerful, powerful mystic. And when he's canonized, will, I'm sure, be canonized as a mystic. You might even see some of that in Mother Teresa from her writings. Mystic simply means a deep spirituality with regards to the Lord. Sometimes that spirituality shows itself in an active life, sometimes in writing, sometimes a contemplative life. But the mysticism refers to the deep spirituality. Master Eckhart was born in Germany, was a university professor. And a master means a university professor. And he was touched deeply by this call to personal spirituality. Master Eckhart's writings today are very, very often used for doctoral theses in theology. He's very much studied today. He became a Dominican and studied first in Paris and then in Cologne. He wrote an awful lot and was a spiritual director to many. He was also a very powerful preacher. He stressed the nearness of the Lord to people and the existence of a divine spark within everybody. So what he talked about, see that, I think you remember, I hope you remember, when I was a little boy, the way the church was set up was there was a tabernacle back behind the altar, and then there was an altar at which there was a priest, and then there was a railing, and then there was a congregation out here. And the model that was set up was the idea that you had the tabernacle and the priest facing the tabernacle, not the people. The priest receiving from the Lord, then the priest preaching and passing that on to the people. And this was seen as this hierarchy, so that the clergy stood between the people and God. So when you prayed, you had the priest say a mass, or you participated in something the priest did, but prayers came from the people to God through the priest. And education, grace, came to the people through the priest. Eckhart was totally against that. He says that each one of us has his intimate, personal relationship with God. And we see it primarily in the sacraments, baptism, confirmation, communion. There is this very close relationship with God, and a person has the ability to spark that and use that relationship that they have with God rather than dealing with an intermediary. And I'll tell you that from a study of sacred scripture, you know that the word priest in the Bible is never used, in the Christian scriptures, is never used of a human being other than Jesus. So that Paul, at one point, only once, talks about doing priestly ministry, but he doesn't call himself a priest. According to the Christian scriptures, God is here. The priest stands between God and the person, whoever the person is. But our priest is Jesus Christ. And the interesting thing is, our priest is actually God too. So as a matter of fact, we have an intimate relationship with God. So Jesus is the intermediator with the Father, but we're directly in contact with Jesus, and Jesus is himself God. Okay? So, as he saw this divine spark, he demanded contemplation and prayer as a basis to the service of those around us. Okay? So he said that when we do corporal works of mercy are feeding the hungry, taking care of the sick, that sort of thing. When we do charitable work, the basis of it must be our relationship with God. And so that this relationship with God should lead us to care for people. And if that does, we care for people in a very different way than if it's a work. If it is a result of our relationship with God, we care very differently. And I would cite the example, let's say you're a doctor, and you take care of people in a hospital, and you do a good job, and you're a very good doctor, and all that sort of thing. Well, suppose simultaneously your mother is very sick at home, so you're taking care of her as well. You know, you take care of your mother very differently. And not that you're less attentive or anything like that, but there's a relationship there. Well, what Eckhart was saying, you and I need to cultivate that relationship. So as a priest, when I deal with the congregation, I need to deal with the congregation not as though I'm coming to them from God to tell what's wrong. I need to cultivate a relationship in which I'm serving them in relationship to their God, and that they, in receiving my service, are making me function in relationship to my God, so that our relationship is always tied to the God above us. It's a mysticism thing. He says, contemplation and intellectual learning were stressed. He said, contemplation and holiness brings us into this relationship with God, but education and study helps us to understand it and explain it. Some of his teachings were condemned because it was thought that he did not clearly distinguish between the people and God, namely that he believed we somehow were a part of God. We were that much. But his influence would last right up until the days of Luther. Master Eckhart was very, very powerful in his influence. The disciples of Eckhart would then carry on his work and his teachings. John Fowler was a native of Strasbourg and one of the greatest of the medieval preachers. And he always stressed charity and action after the example of Jesus. Again, you see the same thing, because Jesus will tell us again and again in his ministry is because of his relationship with the Father. I say only what the Father gives me. I do only what the Father tells me. This whole thing. And so he said, we too need to carry this on. Henry Suso at first emphasized self-denial and penance, but he came to stress detachment from excessive concern for worldly things. He was another disciple of Eckhart. He originally was very into doing penance and self-denial and fasting, and all. He was all into that. However, under the influence of Eckhart, he talked about detachment from things. I'll tell you the difference. The difference is, suppose I'm a millionaire, okay? I can decide I'll give away the $1 million and go off and go into the monastery or something. Now that would be penance or self-denial. But suppose I were to decide I have $1 million, I'm going to use it for the benefit of the world. Okay? Now how I would decide to use that, I would be detached from it. It's not going to be mine, it's for the world, but I'm going to use it in certain ways. One of those is detachment, and the other is self-denial. Okay? He was also a great poet and a strong defender of the teachings of Eckhart. The reason why we'll mention as we go through some of these characters, are very fine poets. They became famous as poets. Why would that be important? Because if you're a poet, then people are putting it to music. If people are putting to music, more people will hear it than will ever hear it in a sermon or a teaching. And so the teachings of poets became very, very powerful. Okay? Why don't we call it there, and we will pick it up and go through more of these individuals who are very interested in the holiness of the church at this time in history. And we'll go through more of them next week. Thank you very much.